This is the first lecture for Friday, April 24th. Part of our coverage of ecosystem ecology deals with the influence that humans have on ecosystems. Now, we could have looked at the influence of humans on organisms, on populations, on communities. In certain aspects of what we covered in those different subunits of ecology, we did look at the effects of humans on populations. We looked at some populations that have been affected dramatically by humans. We looked at communities and the effects of things like pollution and habitat destruction on communities as well, but this is going to be strictly focused on humans. With more than 7 billion people on Earth, greedy people that want things, need things, there's going to be a priority for things that humans need to be able to survive over everything else. There always has been. And so when there's a shortage of resources, then other species tend to lose out. It's not always like that, and there's a lot of concern that a lot of people have for other species, but it's certainly a balancing act between all these people and all the different resources that we require and everything else. So that's what we're going to focus on this last 2 lectures, today and Monday. First of all, we've looked at biodiversity. We looked at diversity of communities when we were dealing with community ecology, and we saw that there were different ways of measuring diversity within a community. Different people have different measurements of diversity. One of the easiest things to look at was the number of species. And it's really a fairly good representation of biodiversity, the number of species. But there's also places around the world where there's a lot of endemic species, which means that they're found nowhere else in the world. So just because a location has a really high biodiversity doesn't necessarily mean that it's more important than other places. And you might look for a location on Earth that's got a combination of high biodiversity and a high rate of endemism, a high rate of endemic species. Those are important areas. But let's ask this question first of all. What is the value of biodiversity? You guys are young, idealistic compared to a lot of people in the world, and so you probably have different points of view about the value of biodiversity compared to some other people. But throughout the world, there's areas that have been identified as of particular interest because they have a high level of biodiversity. There's a lot of different species there. And so you guys, as students in an ecology class, certainly have an appreciation for what biodiversity is, what diversity means, some of the benefits of diversity that we've looked at in terms of communities. But let's ask this question. You go down to South America, to the Amazon, you can find a tree where there's 47 different species of ant. Now, we saw some of the amazing things that ants do, some of the relationships that they have with other organisms, certainly very interesting organisms, display some social behaviors that are interesting. But why would anybody care if there were only 46 species of ant on this tree in the Amazon? Not 47, but 46. One of them went extinct. Who would ever know? Who would ever care? Well, that's a different kind of question than the value of biodiversity. But one ant and another ant and another ant and a bird and a butterfly, those tend to add up. And every species that disappears is a decline in biodiversity. So if you ask people around the world, if you ask people in the United States in particular, since that's where we are, then the answer that people often give, and the standard answer is, well, everything's interrelated, based on this ecology class, study of interactions. Everything has its role in a community or an ecosystem. And so when you start removing the pieces, it's going to affect the whole community, whole ecosystem. And that's not something that we want to see. That's the standard answer. But then somebody else might come along and say, well, yeah, but things have been going extinct forever. And look where we are now. Things are just fine. Well, let's look at some of the responses, the general responses that people have in terms of answering this question. What's the value of biodiversity? It's interesting in a way, very disturbing to some people, and other people don't care so much, that this is such a political question, that there's the left and there's the right. There's conservative and there's liberal points of view in terms of environmental conservation. Very different points of view. But some of the reasons why people value biodiversity, we'll look at 3 different common responses when people are asked this question. What's the value of biodiversity? Well, this is along the lines of the standard response that we've got a moral responsibility to our fellow species. We're not the only things that live on Earth. We can't just wantonly destroy whatever we want, take whatever we want, and let everything fall by the wayside in our wake. That we've got there's all these other species that we live with. And in surveys that have asked Americans this, people in the United States, about 70% agree with this sentiment that we can't just have no concern whatsoever for our fellow species. So, in fact, the government of the United States, the people of the United States, back in the early 70s, established the Endangered Species Act. They passed that law. There was Richard Nixon was president, Republican people were responsible for that legislation, along with some other legislation that was really strong in terms of environmental conservation. So we've decided as a country that we don't want things to go extinct. The Endangered Species Act, looking at populations of different things, monitoring populations of plants and animals, and trying to make sure that we make an effort to reduce the number of extinctions that take place. One of the questions is, how good are we at telling a valuable species from a useless one? Well, we're not really very good. How good are we at predicting what's going to happen to an ecosystem when a species disappears? So, there's things that people value, the eagle and maybe wolves and whales and turtles and things like that people really like. But what about a beetle or that ant or mosquitoes? Maybe there's some things we don't care so much about and we're not so interested in. They're not cute and they don't elicit the same type of response, positive response, and oh no, we should make sure they don't go extinct. So there's all kinds of different species. Another more selfish response to that question is, maybe I don't care that much about some species, but you know what I do care about? I care about the potential for using these species to benefit humans. And there's all kinds of drugs. We've seen this with some of the secondary compounds in plants, and there's universities around the country that specialize in this, looking at natural products that can be derived from some organism, usually some chemical that you can, you don't harvest these and use that animal or that plant as a source for that chemical. Initially you do that, but then you synthesize this natural product and you manufacture it and then you use it. That's what people are hoping to do, and then make money off of it, but also benefit humans. Well, if you look at all the different species out there, marine species, terrestrial species, invertebrates and vertebrates, it's really just a small number, a small percentage that we've actually looked at very carefully in terms of how they might benefit humans. So people say, well, we don't want something that's got the cure for cancer to go extinct. And we come along and say, oh, yeah, that's 47th species of ant. I guess we should have paid attention to that because that ant manufactured some chemical that was a cure for cancer. Too bad. So people are interested in preserving biodiversity for that. Maybe one of these things that we're preserving is going to help us in the long run. Another thing that a lot of people realize, you students in this class, more than most people certainly, is that biodiversity, when biodiversity is maintained, when biodiversity is high, then there's essential services that are provided for communities, for ecosystems, largely benefiting humans as well. There's some services that are provided that benefit us, so it's another selfish way. Maybe we don't care so much about any particular species, but from a selfish point of view, we realize that more biodiversity means better things for humans. So some of the things that we might have looked at already in this class is that, there's a lot of plants, a lot of vegetation, more oxygen is being produced. Helps prevent climate change, a more politically correct way of saying global warming. And in terms of the soil, the kind of things, it increases productivity, the rate at which plants grow. And especially if it's something that we harvest or if it's plants that are contributing towards producing oxygen, there's also pests that are controlled. There's recycling of organic matter, recycling of nutrients that we looked at. And those nutrients are going to make their way into avenues that humans are going to want eventually. And very resistant to pests, outbreaks of pests, the population explosion of something. They tend not to happen when there's biodiverse communities and ecosystems around. And also, we're running into this problem these days with the shortage of bees and pollination, is that there's a reserve of pollinators and other plants if biodiversity is maintained. Well, here's the fourth thing, is that it's not just those services that are provided, but the whole community functions more optimally. Some of the results of that is that those services that provide us, so there's a lot of overlap between these, but it's not just the things that benefit us, but the whole functioning of the communities, ecosystem, is maintained at a higher level if biodiversity is maintained at a higher diversity, at a higher level. So greater species richness, more species, translates to a number of different services for us, but also stability of the community and just a general way that the community functions. So let's look in more detail about some of these answers to this question of what is the value of biodiversity? Well, sometimes it's easier to see the results when biodiversity has declined, when the number of species from a community or an ecosystem is whittled away and the number becomes lower and lower, then you see the results, as opposed to saying, realizing ahead of time, well, if we decrease the number of species, if the biodiversity decreases, we're going to see these kind of negative effects. Well, some of the effects of biodiversity that we'll look at have to do with niche opportunities, for one, herbivore suppression, two, biomass, which is basically production in relation to biodiversity, and then stability. And we looked at resistance in a number of ways. We looked at resilience. We looked at some of these things before in terms of species richness in a community and some of the trials that have been done, some experimental research that's been done, for instance, with crops and maintaining biodiversity in fields, places that you can easily experiment with. Well, in terms of niches, you guys can relate to this because we spent a considerable amount of time talking about niches, looking at communities in terms of this idea of niche. We looked at community relations, species interactions in terms of niches, and this idea that no two species can occupy the same niche, but that's basically what the role of an organism is. So if you look at the number of species of plants, for instance, the more biodiverse an ecosystem is in terms of plants, then the more opportunities there are for everybody else, animals, fungi, insects, invertebrates, vertebrates. There's just more habitat, there's more food, there's more different types of habitat, there's more opportunities for everything. There's more species that you're going to find in communities and ecosystems where there's more plants. So if you look at the number of plants in an ecosystem in a community, then the number of animals, the number of invertebrates, the number of vertebrates, the number of fungi, the number of roles that there are that can be filled increases. There's an increase in niche opportunities. There's increased opportunity, and it's a self-perpetuating situation where this high biodiversity maintains a lot of different roles for species. Another thing that's associated with biodiversity is herbivore suppression. Now, it's a bad thing in an ecosystem to have too much herbivory, to have organisms that are too successful in feeding on plants. That's going to reflect negatively on that community. The plants, there's going to be less primary production, there's going to be less oxygen, there's going to be less food that's available for everybody else. So an ideal ecosystem is one where herbivory is moderated, and with these additional roles or niches that can be filled with different habitat, different prey items, then the predator populations can be maintained. And with a healthy predator population, that tends to control the amount of herbivores, keeps the herbivore populations down, which controls herbivory, or keeps it in check anyway. So if you have less herbivores, you've got more plant growth, you've got more productivity, you've got more oxygen being produced, you've got more food available for everybody else. You can imagine the positive benefits of greater range of predators that are controlling herbivores that lead to greater production of the plants. In terms of biomass, we looked at this before, the influence of species richness or biodiversity on biomass. Now, sometimes this is an ecosystem or a community that we're interested in, that we want to harvest this or we're taking advantage of this, that biomass is important to us. Other times, it's not that particular ecosystem or community where this biomass is increased, but it's a neighboring one. Maybe it's a farm, or it's an orchard, or it's a forest that we're taking advantage of. So the biomass increase might translate away from this biodiverse ecosystem to some region of land or water even that we're more interested in. But the species richness is related to biomass. As you can see in this figure, it might peak and start to tail off if there's too many species, but in general, as you start whittling away the number of species, then the biomass tends to decline. This is another aspect that we looked at when we were looking at communities and community richness, the species diversity. an argument for maintaining biodiversity is that these communities and these whole ecosystems are more stable. They're less prone to disturbance. They're less prone to some catastrophic event taking place. They're a lot more stable. And we looked at stability earlier in terms of resilience and in terms of resistance to perturbation, and then the ability to bounce back when there's some drastic change or some catastrophe. So this is certainly the case that species richness, the more biodiverse an ecosystem is, the more stable it tends to be. And along with stability comes all these different aspects that we think are favorable traits of a community or an ecosystem. To be able to maintain these services, to be able to provide a certain amount of biomass, to be able to resist things that are going to affect us in a negative way, whether that's storm, flooding, or the invasion of pests. Stability is an important component. Another thing that we looked at before was the ability of ecosystems or communities to resist the invasion especially of pests, things that we don't want. And this figure shows the number of invading species versus plant species richness in a community or an ecosystem, where at these high levels of biodiversity in this ecosystem, up to 60, or actually between 30 and 60 different species of plants, this ecosystem is pretty resistant to invasion. But as you reduce the number of species, you get down below 30, and you get closer and closer to 0, then they're not very good at resisting invaders. There's not the natural enemies, there's not competitors. The ecosystem itself isn't so well set up to resist invaders. And we saw this invasion meltdown and some other aspects of the resistance of ecosystems to invasions. And speaking of that, invasional meltdown, we looked at this before, where you've got a community. Once this starts, you've got some invader, then it sets the stage for the next invader and the next one and the next one. And you can get to the point where once this resistance is passed and a community or an ecosystem is susceptible to invasion, then the next one is easier. The next invader, the next one, the next one. So it's a snowball effect. And you have this invasion, susceptibility to invasion that's increased by every new invader that comes in makes it easier for the next one. And we looked at this as well, the susceptibility to drought, that if you've got a lot of plant species, then this is another aspect of community stability, ecosystem stability, that having a lot of species conveys towards that ecosystem. This shows the effects of drought on different communities and versus how many plant species there are. So you get to a point where there's fewer and fewer plant species, then the biomass, the ability of these plants to grow following the drought, is severely impacted when you have a few species versus when you have a lot of species. They still suffer quite a bit when there's a drought. The productivity is cut in half, but when you get down below 5 species or 6 species, then the amount of biomass, the amount of production, really drops off quickly, because you have little resistance to disturbance, even if it's something like water where the disturbance is taking place. Okay, well, that's a good place to stop for this first lecture, Friday, April 24th, and we can continue on with, let's say you recognize this problem, you recognize the importance of biodiversity, and you recognize the importance of maintaining biodiversity. Then the next question is, well, how do you accomplish that? That's what we'll look at next.